All right, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. Today we're going to be undergoing a patient input consultation for the new HCV medication MK2. Just a brief note about CTAC. We are the Canadian Treatment Action Council. We're Canada's national civil society organization addressing access to treatment, care, and support for people living with HIV and hepatitis C. As part of our regular work and mandate, we provide updates and consultations like this about new medications treating HIV or HCV. Just a little bit about what we'll go over today. I'm going to briefly discuss the common drug review and market access. We'll talk about what we know about MK2. We'll talk about how we know it from clinical trials. And then we'll talk about what we can conclude from this presentation. And I'll direct you to a short survey that is very, very integral to the whole patient input process. So to begin, I'm going to play a short video. You should see it in your video window on the presentation. This is something we've developed at CTAC to briefly go over the common drug review and how it works. Again, please make sure you have *6'd your line to mute it, and we'll resume once the video is concluded. Thanks very much.
Canada has a unique healthcare system, and sometimes it can be complicated to navigate. Canada's healthcare system is made up of 13 separate provincial and territorial programs and 6 additional federal plans, making healthcare in Canada a shared responsibility between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. A drug can take as long as a decade to develop, and our regulatory review bodies might take as many as 5 more years to conduct thorough reviews. So what's going on during that time, and how do medical treatments get from clinical trials to a public insurance plan? Once a pharmaceutical manufacturer has created a new treatment or molecule, they must take it through clinical trials before bringing it to market in Canada. These trials evaluate whether a drug works and whether it's safe. A drug can take years to develop and study, with clinical trials often involving hundreds of people testing the drug. Manufacturers will create many molecules, but only those that prove effective during clinical trial are developed further. Some molecules are developed and never advanced to become a treatment. It is important to consider that treatment development costs a lot of money, and manufacturers will generally seek to recoup those costs. When the manufacturer is confident that they have a competitive, effective treatment, they will submit the drug, along with clinical trial data, to Health Canada for review. Health Canada reviews the drug to determine if it provides clinical benefit and if it is safe. Once Health Canada concludes that a drug is safe and likely to provide clinical benefit, it is approved for sale on the market. And can appear on private insurance plans. However, if a drug is to be listed in most of Canada's public formularies, the process is long from over. These are the public drug plans that many Canadians depend on in order to access essential medications. After Health Canada approval, the drug in question is reviewed by another body, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, or CADTH. This agency is funded by the federal and provincial governments except Quebec, which has an independent process. CADTH oversees a process called the Common Drug Review, or CDR, which conducts a review called Health Technology Assessment, or HTA. Many countries conduct HTAs, and there are different ways to measure health technologies. An HTA is conducted not just on medications and drugs, but also on any health technology, like a new pacemaker design, for example. Ultimately, the Common Drug Review seeks to answer the question, is this treatment cost-effective, and will it provide improved clinical benefits to Canadians? The Common Drug Review will assess the drug for listing on public insurance plans and must conclude whether it can provide equal or improved clinical benefit compared to its cost, and whether that makes it more cost-effective than similar treatments. How much money should be spent to achieve how much clinical benefit? Once the CDR concludes its assessment, it sends a recommendation to all health plans, federal, provincial, and territorial, as to whether or not the provinces should cover the cost of this medication and list it on their plan. The CDR will suggest that the provinces either A. list the treatment, B. list the treatment with clinical criteria and/or conditions, C. not list the treatment at the submitted price, or D. not list the treatment at all. Most treatments do not get an unconditional listing suggestion, and the majority are either not recommended for listing or recommended with conditions. In fact, in many of their reviews, the CDR has rejected or suggested not to list at a manufacturer's submitted price. Listing recommendations from the CDR are not binding or final. The provinces and territories receive the recommendation and are free to review the drug against their own standards or make their own conclusion from the Health Canada and CDR reviews. This allows provinces to realize local priorities and more closely manage provincial healthcare needs based on their budgets and populations. Each province does this independently, as each is the public payer of their respective province or territory. While many provinces and territories conduct their own reviews, some smaller provinces tend to follow the CDR recommendation and list or not list accordingly. As new drugs are developed and new needs are realized, provinces and territories must be vigilant to maintain a public listing that addresses contemporary local realities and responsibilities. Often, older treatments must be considered against newer treatments to see which contributes the most value for the most reasonable cost. This system is designed to review and respond to new treatments as they are developed, while allowing room for both price evaluation and regional healthcare priorities. Conducting HTA reviews at several levels with room for conditions allows provinces and territories more control over their public plans and healthcare mandates, while still allowing Health Canada and the CDR.
So there we have the Common Drug Review in a nutshell. Just to briefly summarize, once a manufacturer wants to have a medication sold in Canada, they submit it to review by Health Canada. They then deliver a notice of compliance, which just says that the submission in question complies with our food and drug laws. Now, once that's been done, the treatment is available on the market. But to get the drug listed on public insurance involves an extra process, the Common Drug Review, which we've just gone over. So the Common Drug Review, as we've discussed, evaluates whether or not there's any social value in the drug over other drugs and whether or not we can recommend it for listing in the provinces. Part of the Common Drug Review is asking patients, asking advocates, asking stakeholders what they think of the new treatment in question. So that's part of this process. We'll let you know what we happen to think of the treatment, what we've found in clinical trial, and then we'll ask you to complete a survey, which I'll send you the link to at the very end of the presentation, and we'll have you complete that survey, the data from which will be used to fulfill a report that we will send to the Common Drug Review as part of their review of this process. Now, what makes MK2 pretty interesting and a little bit unusual in the normal process is that MK2 does not yet have a notice of compliance from Health Canada. So Health Canada has not approved this for sale on the private market or elsewhere at all yet. They're reviewing it now, and you can have Health Canada and the Common Drug Review review your submission at the same time. They can be parallel reviews. If your notice of compliance doesn't occur or is at any time revoked or not approved, then the Common Drug Review will also stop. We cannot review or give a suggestion on any medication that hasn't been given a notice of compliance. So we expect there should be no problem with the notice of compliance for MK2, but because there isn't one, we don't yet have an indication for it specifically. So this makes MK2 a little bit unusual for most submissions that we go over. So let's look at MK2. Again, it's manufactured by Merck. MK2 is a treatment for chronic HCV. It's made up of the molecules Grazoprevir and Elbasvir. It is a fixed-dose combination, once daily and oral, so we don't know what format that will be, pill, tablet, capsule, but we do know it will be once daily and oral, and it will be 100 milligrams of Grazoprevir and 50 milligrams of Elbasvir. Grazoprevir is an NS3-4A inhibitor. Elbasvir is an NS5A inhibitor. And again, we don't have the indication from Health Canada yet, but I suspect we're looking at genotypes 1, 4, and 6 based on the trial data, and I'll show you how we got to that conclusion. Just a bit about the inhibitors we're talking about. The old standard of care, pegylated interferon, was based on the principle of mimicking the body's natural processes to fight viruses. Interferon's produced in the body naturally to fight viruses. We synthesized it to stay in the body longer and mimic natural processes, and that was the first standard of care for chronic HCV. Now we're in a new era of medicines called the direct-acting antivirals, and instead of trying to mimic body's natural processes, they actually attack viral processes specifically. So when we say things like NS3-4A or NS5A inhibitors, what we're talking about are specific viral processes or sites of replication, of inserting genetic information into the host cell, all sorts of little processes of the virus. That's what DAAs do. They attack those processes rather than bolstering the immune system or mimicking the immune system. So that's what has led us to this new revolution in treatment, which has us with treatments that are 95, 96, 99% effective. It's also worth noting that many new HCV medications pair similar NS3-5A inhibitors, and in fact, Holcuropac has a similar approach for its attack on viral mechanisms. We're also happy to report that Merck's clinical trials have been pretty exhaustive, treated in over 1,500 patients, and many clinical trials have focused on traditionally neglected, hard-to-treat patients. So that'll be interesting data I'd like to share with you today as well. Just a note on genotype, I told you we were thinking 1, 4, and 6 as the indicator for MK2. This is a brief graph by Messina et al. Everyone uses this graph. It's very, very good. It's pretty up-to-date, detailing the preponderance and the burden of genotypes of HCV across the world. So we'll see in North America, our problem is mostly with genotype 1. You'll notice the Middle East and Africa have a bit more of an issue with genotype 4, and we expect genotype 6 to be in the indication for MK2, and that has more prevalence in Asia. So an interesting medication covering several genotypes, which is great, and in Canada we've been saying we want more genotypic, pan-genotypic medications wherever possible. So this is heading in that direction. So the Common Drug Review submission for MK2 is based on clinical trial data and a product monograph. We're going to look at trial data today. Specifically, we're going to look at the C-SALVAGE series of studies, which looked at treatment experienced, treatment naive, and co-infected. We're also going to look at the C-Worthy study and the C-SALVAGE studies. And let's remember, like I've said, we're talking about direct-acting antivirals now, so the new class of medications, whereas the old class, pegylated interferon, really varied with its success rate at the very, very high end in the high 70s, but still considered very, very toxic. We are now in what's considered to be the interferon-free era. So we don't use interferon anymore wherever we can avoid it, and with the new DAAs, we don't have to, and we're still getting 95% cures in most cases across several different treatments. So you may have heard about the treatment revolution in HCV. I concur. I think we're very much there. It's a very exciting time. Let's look first at C-SALVAGE, treatment naive. This is a phase 3 randomized placebo-controlled study. Looked at 1, 4, and 6 for genotypes. Had a 12-week course of treatment with follow-up during the 20 weeks after treatment. And we're looking for SVR12 here. Again, SVR12, sustained virologic response, that's SVR. That's what passes for a cure in HCV language. In this case, SVR12, we're talking about 12 weeks of treatment and then monitoring 12 weeks after treatment and still anticipating a 0 viral load. And that's how we know that we've been cured with HCV. Specifically with C-SALVAGE treatment naive study, the baseline characteristics of the patients involved, we're looking at pan-genotypic, like I said, 1, 4, and 6. We've got 421 adults with chronic HCV. None of them have undergone treatment before. They all have 1, 4, or 6, and we've included some cirrhotics, which are a very difficult to treat population. No surprise here in the demographics. Most HCV trials look at white men who are middle-aged, and in this case, we're looking at no ribavirin at all in the administering of MK2, so patients only get MK2. Ribavirin is a bit of a sticking point for most of the people who view our webinars and who interact with us here, most patients. Ribavirin is considered pretty tricky to tolerate. A lot of people consider it something of a holdover from the interferon era. We're seeing more and more trials looking to eliminate ribavirin. It is associated with dermatological events, rashes and pruritus and such, so it is something we're trying to get away from. Now in this case, we know we're talking about treatment-naive patients. A lot of recent clinical trial data suggests that we don't need ribavirin necessarily in all naive patients, but it may be something we come back to for patients who have failed a previous treatment. But I'll move on to that as we get closer. So the results of C-EDGE were pretty impressive. Again, we're looking at SVR12. Genotype 1A had a 92% cure after SVR12. GT1Bs were 99%. GT4s were 100%. Meanwhile, genotype 6 not as successful at only 80%. So again, even 80% is a fantastic rate considering the first standard of care, but it's pretty low compared to what we expect from the new direct-acting antivirals. All things told, however, 92% is not bad, and 99 and 100 for the GT1Bs and GT4s is very compelling. The next trial we're going to look at is the Seaworthy trial. This is currently a phase 2 study looking at SVR12 with MK2 with or without ribavirin. And specifically, we're looking at GT1Bs who are treatment naive. So you may recall GT1Bs in the C-EDGE did rather well. So now we're looking at whether we can improve on this with the addition of ribavirin, because you'll remember we didn't include it. And this is based on the understanding that treatment-naive, people who've never been treated before, don't necessarily need it. So this is the trial that looks into that a little more closely. It's an 8-week course of treatment, which is also deviating from the standard a little bit. And of the 60 patients, 30 of them will get MK2 and ribavirin, but the other 31 will only get MK2. So that's how we've isolated ribavirin as a variable here. Again, we're looking at 61 adults with chronic HCV. They're treatment naive. They're all GT1Bs. And again, middle-aged white males is the common demographic for this treatment. Let's look a bit at the results. Now, the graph's a little misleading. We're looking at half percentage points on that graph, so keep in mind, we're just looking to illustrate the difference. MK2 plus ribavirin over 8 weeks had a 93% success rate, whereas MK2 on its own over 8 weeks had a 94%. So really, we're talking about 1% difference here. And considering the side effects associated with ribavirin, I don't think we'd necessarily administer it just for a 1% loss. So the big conclusion here that's pretty exciting is GT1B specific, but possibly GT1 treatment-naive patients, ribavirin is not necessary. Because again, remember, GT1As also did very well in C-EDGE. So also the other exciting bit is 8 weeks of treatment for GT1B specifically and no ribavirin. That's pretty exciting. I hope you'll share my enthusiasm for that. That's a very good conclusion. 8 weeks of treatment with well over 90% success rate. That's new and that's exciting. We're going to look at another C-EDGE trial that looked at treatment experience. Now, what's really interesting for a lot of people who do this work is, sure, we may be talking about 95, 96, 97% SVR in the new medications, but really that means some people will fail this medication. Not many, but some. So what do we do when people fail a brand new medication? Well, there's been lots of work done on what happens when people fail old medications, and that's what's happening in this trial right here. There will be a future one that we're going to look at today that reviews failures of new DAAs, but this one is looking at people who have failed pegylated interferon, didn't have a response to that medication, and are being treated again with MK2. So this is important work. We have to understand how to treat those people who have failed. So this one would be treating people who had failed a very old standard of treatment, but nevertheless, that's an important population to find out ideal treatments for. So in C-EDGE treatment experience, looking at people who have failed pegylated interferon and ribavirin, we're looking for at people who have genotype 1, 4, or 6. Some have cirrhosis, some do not. We're also including some people who are co-infected with HIV and hepatitis C, which is a population that CTAC specifically is always looking out for. We're also looking at 12-week versus 16-week treatments with or without ribavirin. And again, as we've said, ribavirin tends to find a place in treating people who have failed a previous treatment. Again, we're looking at 420 adults in this trial, and it's with or without ribavirin. So the results here are fairly interesting. At 12 weeks with ribavirin, we had 94% SVR. At 16 weeks with ribavirin, we had 97, so a 3% jump. Whereas without ribavirin, the success rate stays static at 92. So that tells us actually that ribavirin still has a place in the treatment of people who have failed a previous treatment. In this case, like I said, we're looking at people who failed the first standard of care that we don't really even use anymore. But it's still important to know for someone who may have failed a very, very difficult to tolerate treatment years ago, that may have kept them from looking into a new treatment now. So we do have options for treating those people. So one of the other conclusions that came out of here was, in reviewing the C-SALVAGE data, investigators evaluated not just that a patient had failed a previous treatment, but how they did. Was it a relapse? Did they only partially respond to the medication? Did they not respond at all? And they were able to differentiate what we do next depending on how they responded. So for example, relapsers don't seem to need ribavirin at all, and they do benefit from a 12-week treatment, while people who partially responded or didn't respond at all do require ribavirin, and they should take it for 16 weeks. So that's an interesting thing to find from this series of C-SALVAGE studies. And it's worth considering that ribavirin still has a role in HCV treatment. We'd rather it didn't, but it still does. And it's also interesting to note through the MK2 trials how investigators are getting rather creative about evaluating treatment duration against SVR. So we are looking at 8, 12, 16, 24 weeks. A lot of trials are evaluating several different time periods to see what the key element of that treatment is and what we need to keep in mind when treating different populations. So this is an interesting trial, I hope you'll agree. This is the C-SALVAGE, and like I said, we're really interested to find out what do we do with people who have not successfully achieved SVR after a new direct-acting antiviral treatment. So C-SALVAGE is the trial that looks at that. Admittedly, the DAAs it's looking at are Grazoprevir, Telaprevir, and Cimeprevir, which are not the new standard of treatment, which are not necessarily going to be used a great deal moving forward. But this is what MK2 has been tested against. So the people we're looking at have been treated for HCV with Grazoprevir, Telaprevir, or Cimeprevir, and they have not completed, they have not achieved SVR, and now we're treating them again with MK2. As I've said, because these people are treatment experienced, we will be including ribavirin in this trial, and this one also includes an early evaluation at SVR4. That means we're checking in at SVR4 after 4 weeks of treatment, 4 weeks after treatment, just to see how the virus is responding, if it's responding. We're not suggesting that we're anywhere close to 4 weeks of treatment as a standard, but it is interesting how that time goes down and down as the years progress, and principal investigators are looking at shorter and shorter durations of treatment. We're not there yet, but it's encouraging to see them evaluating that earlier. Again, the characteristics here, we're looking at people who have failed a DAA treatment. It's 78 adults with chronic HCV, treatment experience with one of the 3 DAAs I've mentioned. All of them are genotype 1. We have included some cirrhotics, and ribavirin is administered in this. So let's look at the results of C-SALVAGE. Again, this graph is really only covering about 7 percentage points, so keep that in mind when you're looking at the scale. Overall, the end of trial response was 100%. Early evaluations at SVR12 were 97.5. All patients who completed were 96.2, and those patients who had specifically had virologic failure before this trial were 95.5. So this is great. This is some early evidence about that we can, with, say, third-generation DAAs, address people who had not successfully completed Generation 1 DAAs. So we're moving along, and we're also able to now figure out who we can treat who may have failed the early DAAs. As I've said, evaluating SVR4 does not mean we're looking at an SVR4 treatment. It just means we're looking for markers early on that may tell us what we can expect for treatment duration. Now, C-SALVAGE, again, I've looked at C-SALVAGE treatment-naive C-SALVAGE treatment experience. There's also a C-SALVAGE trial looking specifically at co-infected, and this is a pretty exciting one. This is led by Jürgen Rockstro, who's a great principal investigator, does a lot of work in HCV medications. Again, this is looking at people who are co-infected with HIV and HCV. They would have been treatment naive to HCV therapy, so they would have never been treated for their hepatitis C. They will have genotype 1, 4, or 6, and there are some cirrhotics and some non-cirrhotics involved. As far as the HIV status of the people in the trial, they have to satisfy one of two conclusions. Either they are naive to antiretroviral therapy with greater than 500 CD4 count, or they are experienced with ART for over 8 weeks and have a CD4 count of over 200 with undetectable HIV RNA. Most of the HIV positive individuals in this trial are using a tenofovir-based regimen. This is a pretty huge study as far as breadth and scope. There are study sites, Europe, Australia, United States. I know there are other study sites that are smaller involved in this one as well. Looking at a 12-week treatment with 48-week follow-up. Again, we're looking at almost 220 adults, chronic HCV and HIV, treatment experienced and treatment negative, but not treated for HCV. Genotypes 1, 4, and 6 with some cirrhotics, and we're not including ribavirin in this trial. So let's look at how this broke down. Again, this graph is really just covering all less than 2 percentage points, but we really want to highlight the differences here. All patients achieved SVR at 96.3%. GT1As were 96.5, GT1Bs were 95.5, so really not much difference between these, but we wanted to highlight that there was some discrepancy. Bottom line here is that it was over 95% effective in co-infected patients across several genotypes. That's extremely encouraging. We're now looking at SVR rates for co-infected that are about equal to SVR rates for people who are mono-infected with HCV. That's a real accomplishment there. We haven't seen that for some time. So I'm pretty excited that the investigators looked at this, and I'm very excited with the results. I think it's again, very compelling, pretty impressive. As I've said, SVR12 rates similar to those who are mono-infected with HCV is a big deal. Also, the rates were comparable against cirrhotic and non-cirrhotic patients, which is great. We also found comparable response rates across subgroups, including Black and African American patients who tend to be a little bit more difficult to treat. We're not sure why. There were no discontinuations and very first adverse events in the C-SALVAGE co-infected, and I'm looking at that specifically because we're talking about someone on HIV and HCV medication. Drug-drug interactions are a concern for us. So it was very important for us to monitor, specifically in this trial, but also in all trials, whether or not anyone discontinued or had any serious adverse events while taking HIV ART therapy and HCV DAA therapy. And we were very happy to learn that there were no discontinuations. So a safe, tolerable medication with early results suggesting very few interactions with ART treatment, which is great. This means really that MK2 might be a great choice for first-line treatment for co-infected patients. So that's exciting to say. And it's worth considering other HCV treatments out there. Harvoni demonstrated an SVR discrepancy with co-infected patients. That was in the ION-4 trial. And Holkirapac is not indicated for use in co-infected patients as per the Turquoise-1 trial. We've covered both those trials in consultations before, so you can find them on our CTAC Talks YouTube channel. But that's worth considering when you're thinking about this medication. So let's go over what we know about the adverse events of MK2. Overall, the trials, there were very few discontinuations due to adverse events, and all reported adverse events have been considered pretty mild. Some of the known side effects that we have seen are fatigue, nausea, and these are very common with HCV medications. Arthralgia is a new one. That's joint pain, swelling, stiffness. We haven't seen a lot of that in many HCV meds. And pruritus and rash, which we always associate with ribavirin. We haven't seen that in MK2 on its own, but whenever you've got ribavirin, we tend to see skin and dermatological issues, mostly itching and rash. Now, we always say that patients co-infected with HIV are encouraged to discuss treatment options with healthcare providers, but we're pretty encouraged by the MK2 data early on. But as I've said, some HIV medications can interact with other antivirals. So always talk to your healthcare professional. It's worth considering. But as I've said, we're also very concerned about drug-drug interactions, and that's something we try to report on these trials. So how can we summarize MK2? It's one pill once a day, safe, effective, well-tolerated. When we anticipate a pill, we know it'll be all oral. Most often taken for 12 weeks, some indications for 16 weeks. We anticipate, again, it does not have a Health Canada approval or indications yet, but this is what we're anticipating. One of the really exciting bits I found was 8-week treatment with no ribavirin for treatment-naive GT1Bs who don't have cirrhosis. I know that seems like a really small niche of patient, but it's not, and that's great news for people who are in that category. There's significantly less use of ribavirin than some other treatments, which is great. Also, as I've said, I'm excited that they studied past treatment failures, not just the first-generation pegylated interferon failures, but also people who failed the first generation of direct-acting antivirals. That's good to know. We need that data, so I'm glad to see that happening. Furthermore, they had very significant involvement of HIV/HCV co-infected patients. That's always encouraging to CTAC. That should be very encouraging to you. Not just that they involved these patients in this trial, but that we saw great results from their involvement in this trial. So that's good to know. I hope to see that emulated and replicated in more and more clinical trials and treatments as we go further. And impressive results in traditionally hard to treat groups, right? People who fail to pass treatment are very hard to treat with the next treatment. HIV/HCV co-infected are traditionally a very hard to treat group. We've involved some cirrhotics, and there are a couple of other trials that we looked at, or excuse me, that I've researched but we didn't look at today, looking at people with renal impairment and MK2. So the MK2 clinical trials really did a pretty good job of trying to involve traditionally hard to treat patients, which is really great to see. Excuse me. And finally, there are significantly fewer drug-drug interactions versus HCV regimens that might contain ritonavir. Ritonavir is also often used in DAAs as a booster, and some medications, Tecnavi for genotype 4, I believe, and Holkirapac can both include ritonavir, and sometimes that can interact with HCV regimens, so you have to be very careful with that. But in this case, there is no ritonavir in MK2, so that's certainly helpful. So now it's your turn. As I've said, there's another process, a participatory process to this system, and that involves the participants here today taking a brief survey to let us know what you think about this information, to let us know what you think about this medication in treating HCV, and what your hopes are, what your anticipations are. The patient input we're looking for, and it's based on the questions we'll ask, which in turn inform the questions that the CDR will ask of us, are what's the impact of HCV? What's the impact of current HCV treatment? How do you feel about side effects, and what's tolerable and what's not? If you're not living with HCV, but if you're a caregiver, a service provider, another stakeholder, we still really value your input. For those who have taken MK2, that's a question we have to ask, which is a frustrating one, because as I've said, Health Canada hasn't given this a notice of compliance. So I don't think any Canadians have tried MK2 unless they were involved in clinical trial. So if we're fortunate enough to have some of the clinical trial participants, that would be fantastic. We certainly try to get as many as possible. And then the most important bit about this process is that regulatory bodies will receive your feedback. We will write a report based on the survey data. Not only will the Common Drug Review process use that data in their deliberation, but when they give their suggestion out to the provinces and territories will also receive that feedback. So this is really, really important. I can't stress it enough, and I really, really appreciate your participation in it today. A couple of quick links here. If you want to learn more about the Common Drug Review, there's a link to CADIF, which is the body that oversees the Common Drug Review process. This is how they explain it. We're pretty happy with our video. We think it's rather helpful and accessible, but the CADIF's explanation is also worth a read. And then, of course, no one's better than Katie at knowledge transfer and dissemination. So they've got a really great one sheet about hepatitis C, and there's a link for that there as well. So at this point, I'm going to put out the link to the survey. I'll ask you to please, please, please participate, complete the survey. The data is invaluable. We always use it to write reports. We're really, really good at these reports. We've been recognized by CADIT for our excellence in delivering these reports. And we can't do it without you and your participation. So I know I sound like a bit of a broken record cheerleader on this if you've heard consultation webinars with me before, but I can't stress enough. It's an extremely important part of the process, and I hope that you'll all participate. It really helps. While I prepare this link to appear on the screen, you can go ahead and unmute your line and ask any questions you may have. If you don't want to ask over the line, you can also use the chat window, which is open, but you're certainly welcome to do that now.
Hello?
Hello. And you'll see that survey link is now.
I just had a question about genotype 3. My recollection from reading was that it had been paired with the 2 Merck drugs with Elbasvir with good results in one of the trials. I can't remember.
It's kind of interesting. Just about everybody is giving Elbasvir a go as far as co-formulations are concerned. That's smart from a virology and a treatment perspective. It's a very potent medicine. It's very effective. You may recall, in fact, that Bristol-Myers Squibb just had, through the Common Drug Review, 2 medications, Grazoprevir and Decladisvir, both of which seem to be designed to be co-formulated, specifically with Elbasvir. I know Elbasvir and Decladisvir have done very, very well. But yes, for MK2, there is a ton of trial data. So we cherry-picked a bit here to look at different trials that we thought might be of most interest. And obviously, we try to keep these webinars fairly short, so we can't go over all the trial data. But yes, absolutely, there has been some co-formulation with MK2 and other DAAs. Because MK2 sits in that weird little area vis-a-vis notice of compliance, we don't know what the indication will be as to whether or not it should be treated for which genotype or in co-formulation with what. So yeah, we didn't talk about that here today, but yeah, there has been data on that.
Okay, thanks.
You're very welcome.
Hi. Oh, hello.
Hello.
Hi, I just have a quick question. I haven't heard this term before, at least not that I can remember. Co-infected and mono-infected?
Right.
And that refers to what?
What we're looking at when we say mono-infected, we mean someone who's infected with just hepatitis C. Because CTAC mandate is to look at treatment issues impacting people with hepatitis C and people with HIV, we also keep an eye on trial data that looks at people who have both HIV and hepatitis C. So in that case, we'll say someone being co-infected with HIV and HCV, or someone being mono-infected with HCV. You can also obviously be mono-infected with HIV. That didn't come up because we don't test HCV meds on anyone who doesn't have HCV necessarily. But in this case, I did look at 2 important trials that looked at people who had both HIV and HCV. So that's where that was coming from.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
Of course. And it's worth noting that people who do have that co-infection, HIV and HCV, that's a very interesting population. It's a very important population. Both viruses exacerbate one another. So your HIV progression and your HCV progression, when you have both, it's much, much faster. We talk about decades of liver damage for someone with just HCV. With HIV and HCV, that liver damage proceeds much, much faster. It's also been traditionally a harder to treat population. So early clinical trials have maybe not involved them as much as we'd like, and early data has always shown that people who are co-infected tend to achieve lower rates of SVR than people who are mono-infected. So that's what I was trying to highlight with some of the MK2 trial data is they seem to take on co-infected fairly head-on and got some impressive results. Now that being said, a lot of medications are doing that lately. Whole CuraPack looked at co-infected in its trial data. It just didn't come with quite as good a conclusion.
Okay. Then that leads to another question, and that would be, have you looked at the people who have autoimmune hepatitis as well as hepatitis C?
We've only looked at hepatitis C, to be honest.
Okay.
And in fact, we haven't looked at other viral hepatitis. We haven't looked at hepatitis B. It's true, hepatitis C seems to be something of the belle of the ball in virology right now. There's a lot of pipeline activity. There's a lot of treatment development. And really, there's a cure. So that's exciting. And that's where most of the work is now. But I would agree with you. We have to be very careful to keep in mind all viral hepatitis, all hepatitis, in fact. But in this case, we've just looked at hepatitis C.
Okay. That's good. It's really, like, I'm really excited by what you guys are coming up with, too.
Oh, thanks. And I mean, all we do is sort of disseminate the information. We are not investigators in these trials. We have nothing to do with the trials, but our mandate is to keep patients and stakeholders informed when new treatments are up for review. So this treatment's up for review, and this is what we know from the clinical trial data. We're not leaning this way or that on it. With HCV, it tends to be most patients are interested in most medications being available to most people. And when we're talking about a cure to an illness like this, it's hard not to be cheerleading all the time, but we do try to be fairly objective about what the data says and anticipate what our stakeholders might want to hear about.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. So as I said, I've put up the survey link. It's right here. We're also going to record, we've been recording this minus the questions. We'll put those up on YouTube. For anyone who wasn't able to attend the webinar, they can view this information. They can still complete the survey. But again, at the risk of being a broken record, I implore you to please take a few moments, complete the survey. The data is very, very important to us and will help build a foundation for the report that we'll write to CADIS, which they will read and review while reviewing this drug. So it is a very important process, and I appreciate your participation.
I'm on my tablet, but I can't see where to click on the link. What am I doing wrong? I've got a page up which says questions, question mark, and then your details.
Okay, do you see the little window that says MK2 survey link?
I did, but that page has disappeared now. Let me just go.
Oh,
yeah, I've got it. Yeah.
Yep.
And
so
so
if you
what do I
click
do?
on either of those, click on either of those bits of text, it should take you right to the URL.
Okay, it's not for some reason, but I'll keep trying. Keep saying unreported content.
Are you sending the survey link via email?
Yes, I will do.
Yeah,
Okay.
that one might be helpful because I can't get it.
Well, there's also the alternative. You can always type this into the URL, surveymonkey.com/r/CTAC_MK2. That text is right there as well. So if the link's not working, it should be fine. We tested it earlier. It seemed to be okay. But if you want to type that, the URL will work. Alternatively, I'm going to be sending it out to the registrants as soon as we're done today.
Yeah, that would be probably the best.
Perfect. We still got a couple minutes. If there's any other questions at all, I'll be happy to help you. Okay, doesn't look like there's any more questions. So I'd like to thank you once again for participating. I sincerely appreciate it. I've already told you about the survey and how important it is, so I'll leave that be. But thanks again in advance for filling it out exhaustively. I sincerely appreciate it. And of course, you can reach me at adam@ctac.ca. I'm always available for questions, for inquiries. I could talk shop all day. So please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I'll be signing off. Very kindly for coming today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated in